Welcome back, everyone, to the Dynamic Decisions podcast, where we explore successful strategies that drive successful decision making in the world of business. Why? Because the best decisions come from great conversations. I'm your host, Teasha Cable, CEO of C Model Data, and today we have a remarkable guest who is making waves in the healthcare sector. Stacey is the Chief Commercial Officer at Medisafe with a wealth of experience in sales, partnerships, and strategic alliances. Stacey is leading the charge in empowering patients through innovative medication management solutions. Stacey, welcome to the show. It is a pleasure to have you here today. Can you start by sharing a little bit about Medisafe and the transformative work that you are doing in medication management?
Thank you, Teasha. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. I've been with Medisafe a little bit over 2.5 years now, and it's been quite a journey. It's been pretty exciting. At Medisafe, we started as a B2C company about 13 years ago, have about 13 million registered users around the world who've been using Medisafe to help manage not only their medications, but their overall healthcare. So patients on Medisafe will create a medicine cabinet. So all of their medications, supplements, anything that they're taking on a regular basis, they put in to get reminders about when to take it, how to take it, also when to do refills. But they're also recording things like doctor's appointments, lab visits. We also have a series of over 100 different health trackers available on Medisafe. So people can track things like their mood, their sleep, their pain. And that becomes super important because I know even for myself, I go to the doctor and the doctor says to me, "How are you sleeping?" And I can remember how I slept maybe the last 2 or 3 nights, but probably can't give a good recollection of the last 6 months maybe, or even a year. And so by opening up my Medisafe and sharing it with my physician, I have a really good picture of my overall health over the last several months or even year that I can share with my physician. And so that's really how we've been supporting patients through their management of medications and their overall health care. And then I'd say about 7 years ago, we started to work with pharmaceutical companies who wanted to support their patients in a digital way to help them be more successful on therapy. And so we started working with pharmaceutical companies to create what I'd call like a digital wraparound to their drug. And this allows patients to have a integrated, personalized, holistic experience. And what we've proven out for patients and for our partners is that by creating this experience, we get patients to start taking their medications and stay on their medications.
Mm.
We know that when patients use their medications adherently, compliantly, appropriately, they actually work. We know that our partners make really good products, but they only work if patients use them the way they're prescribed. And so our value to patients is better outcomes, and our value to our partners is better outcomes.
I think the one thing I'm really appreciating that I'm hearing is the focus on the patient outcomes. So I've spoken recently to a bunch of patients, people who are in under medical treatment, and one of the things that they often complain about is that their outcomes are the things at the bottom of the barrel, right? Like they're not usually cared for. So it's really encouraging to hear that that's the focus. If you were thinking about other organizations in your space, what's some of the most critical elements for those organizations to really think about when they're trying to improve patient outcomes today?
The way we look at it is we need to provide the best experience for a patient. The average patient on Medisafe is on 6 or more meds, right? So they're managing a lot. And that's just medications. Forget all the other things they're managing in their life, like their jobs, their homes, their children, right? So there's a lot to take care of. So what we're doing is we understand that we have to provide the absolute best experience for a patient. And how do we do that? We do that by creating a personalized experience. So on Medisafe, we personalize everything from the kind of messages you get as well as the content that you receive. So, Tisha, you and I could be on the same medication, we could be even in the same demographic, and yet we might have very different needs. You may be newly diagnosed, new on therapy, maybe never injected yourself, and maybe you're on a new injectable medication. And so you have certain needs about learning about your disease, learning how to use your medication, understanding your medication. I may have been diagnosed 3, 4, 5 years ago, been on therapy for a long time, but I don't know how to pay for my medication. I'm really struggling with affordability. So you and I are going to need very different content, right? I'm going to push to you a lot of more educational content, maybe videos on how to inject yourself, injection site trackers. But for Stacey, we're going to provide access to patient assistance programs or different pharmaceutical companies have all these programs. A lot of people have no access to them or don't even know about them. So how do I create an experience for Stacey where she can learn about these programs that can help her pay for her meds? So we're going to put the right content in front of you based on where you are in your specific journey. We're also going to message you maybe very differently. We look at things like tone, voice, cadence, time of day, because we want to make sure that we are reinforcing positive behaviors or helping to change negative behaviors. And you and I may be responding very differently to messaging. You may be needing that, like, you go, girl, you're on a great streak. You've done really great. I may not really need that kind. I may need something that's a little bit more admonishing, like, do you need help? What's happening? Do you not understand? We may just have respond differently. And so we're going to continually test different messaging to see what gets you to take that next best action and do it that way. I always tell people, like, I use Medisafe. I'm a Medisafe user. I'm great about taking my medication Monday through Friday. I get a 7 a.m. reminder. I take my medication. I'm not so good on the weekends. So Medisafe will say, hey, what if we put a weekend mode? We noticed that weekends seem to be a problem for you. Let's set a weekend mode where maybe your reminder comes at 10 o'clock so that we can get you to be a better responder on the weekends as well as you are during the week.
So for our audience, one of the things that I hear here is experience creation, and that experience is created out of personalization. So it makes me often think about, we talk a lot here about context on this show, and context being super important, which leads me to my next question, which is, you have an extensive background in healthcare, but I want to know if you have any frameworks that you use to make high stakes decisions when it comes to forming partnerships that align with the Medisafe mission, and really also when there isn't all the information that you might need.
At Medisafe, we kind of, through a partnership framework we call it sort of better together. How do we build the better together story? And I think that's super important. Medisafe has a very clear value proposition that we offer to patients and our pharmaceutical partners and even payers in some cases. When we're talking to a partner, they also obviously have a strong value proposition. How they go to the market, their go to market strategy, their business. What we aim to do is kind of think about, what is that better together story? How does that 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or hopefully even more than that? So that when we think about the partnership, there has to be value to each of us as individual partners, but there has to be a synergistic value in order to make it worth it from the perspective of spending the time and resources to bring these two entities together. And I think by building that better together story is a great way to start. Right.
One, because it's value based, so that makes a lot of sense. So it makes you come back to, well, what's the value of doing this? So you get an immediate why. Why are we even doing this? Because of this value, and then the outcome is we're better together. I really like it. That's good.
We're better together. And look, we're all busy, right? And we all have to pick and choose how we spend our time and where we put resources. And I think it's worth the time up front to figure out if there really is that synergistic value of bringing these two entities together. And then I also think, obviously clearly understanding what the right business model is for each of the entities, because we want both entities to feel the win, right? It's important for each of us to feel the win and for the combined product to be a win for whoever we're providing a service or a product for.
So when you're looking at these kinds of relationships, how do you evaluate the success of your initiatives? Are there any particular metrics that you find the most revealing?
In terms of a partnership, you're saying?
Yeah, let's stay on the partnership topic. And actually, let's mix it up a little bit, because we're talking about partnerships, but what we found was that there's this value that we're trying to drive for the customer, and we were talking about being better together. So when we're thinking about, are we better together? How do we measure success? And then what are some of the metrics?
So, look, when I think about it, a lot of our partnerships are about creating either a stronger solution or a go to market, where we can look at a series of customers. And so, from my perspective, it's like, is there an unmet need in the market that I cannot fulfill as a Medisafe owner, the product Medisafe, is there something that another partner, if I bring in something that they can do, is it possible that now I can see that I can fulfill an unmet need in the market that I couldn't do just with Medisafe alone? So in our business, it could be things like being able to do better targeting, better segmentation, even, in a patient, when I think about a patient journey, there are things that patients need to go through, especially we work a lot with specialty drugs. So, in the idea of benefits verification or prior authorization, right? So, one of our partnerships allows us to, one of our partners does the benefit verification, does the prior authorization. They work with the payer, the insurance companies to get that information, but they didn't have a patient facing layer. So, we have a great patient facing layer. So, now bringing those two pieces together allows us to offer something. So they're providing a really strong service in getting that prior authorization going, getting that benefit verification doing, but they didn't have a good way to keep the patient engaged. We have a great patient engagement tool, but didn't have all the pieces in place to do the prior auth and the benefit verification. Why that became important is because one of the biggest challenges in the pharma space is something we call the first fill problem or the abandonment. Patients, specialty meds are exploding in our market, but a lot of patients don't have experience with specialty meds. Most of us grew up, we went to our corner drugstore, our CVS, or Walgreens, or pharmacy with a piece of paper. We handed it over, we got a prescription, and we took it home. In the specialty med world, it's very different. Specialty pharmacies, things are getting shipped to us. It's just not the same paradigm that we're used to. So, what we were seeing is, in some cases, up to a 50% abandonment from the time a script is written. About 50% of patients weren't even ever getting the first prescription. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that they just didn't understand the process, didn't understand the system. It seemed like a lot of work, a lot of hassle. And they just said, you know what? It doesn't seem that important. I'm just not going to do it. And that 50% abandonment is bad for the entire industry, right? It's bad for the physician because they wrote a script to help a patient and the patient never fills the script. It's bad for the pharma company. It's bad for the payer. And guess what? It's really bad for the patient because they're not getting treated for something they need to be treated for. So by bringing these two things together, we can actually improve the first fill rate for patients because our partner is getting the benefits verified, they're getting the prior authorization done, and then we can help manage the patient through the process. We lovingly call it the pizza tracker. So think about like a Domino's pizza tracker, you know? So, we're making the pizza, we're putting the pizza in the oven. It's this thing here, like your benefits have been verified. Your script has gone to the specialty pharmacy. And like so we manage the patient through keeping them up to date, informed, educated. And by doing that with our partner, we actually can get patients to that first fill.
Okay, and have you seen by doing that it has increased getting to the
Right.
first?
So that's like a key metric for us is can we actually measure that first fill rate or that decrease in abandonment rate from the prescription to the first fill. And then obviously we do things beyond that first fill because another big problem in the industry is that we see patients dropping off, even on chronic meds that they should be taking over time. We see a very strong drop off at sometimes 3 months, 6 months, and at a year, the numbers can be drastically different. Like as much as 50% of patients could be no longer taking their medications. So we look for partnerships that help to solve those problems, like first fill and long term persistence.
For the audience, what's super interesting for you guys is there's this concept in Stacey's case of first fill and then drop off, but for every business there is a metric very similar that aids in whether or not you're achieving success or not. So I want you to be thinking about what is your first fill, right? What is your drop off? That'd be a really good thing to assess for your business. So, as Medisafe continues to grow, how do you actually make sure that your team is equipped to adapt to the evolving needs of patients and healthcare providers?
So, but we spend a lot of time talking to patients. Think Medisafe is different than a lot of digital health companies that I know about or may have worked for in the past, in that because we started as a consumer business and have those 13 million patients, we have, I think the latest number I said was something like over 50 billion data points from patients, from healthcare providers. And we do something we call an insight survey. So we're constantly talking to our patients, listening to where their unmet needs are, and what could help them be more successful. Recently, we even launched something for healthcare providers because we learned in the market of Alzheimer's disease, there's all these new meds coming onto the market. There was sort of I'd call it drought in the change of how we treat Alzheimer's until very recently when some new drugs were introduced into the market. But these drugs have sort of complicated treatment plans. And what we were hearing from healthcare providers was it was a lot to manage because they needed to manage infusions and MRIs and different lab tests. And what we heard from a lot of these centers and healthcare providers is they were doing it on a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet, which was difficult. It introduces a lot of times the ability for mistakes to happen. By listening to our partners and healthcare providers and patients, we actually were able to create a tool, which we call Pathways, which actually is become like a treatment planning tool. Now, this wasn't something that we had traditionally been our business, but because we were hearing from our customers that there was a really big unmet need in the market, we were able to use our platform and our technology to create a solution that's really been impactful for healthcare providers in terms of them being able to help these patients. I mean, some centers were telling us that they had limited the number of patients they were willing to treat because they just couldn't manage them all. It was just too difficult to manage them. And now that we've been able to give them the tools and the resources to be more efficient and successful, they're actually able to treat more patients, which is super rewarding for us.
Hey, audience, think about your own experiences. If you're in the healthcare and technology space, what decisions have you made that have significantly impacted patient engagement? Share your thoughts with us on LinkedIn or other social media using Decision Dynamics Podcast. Thank you so much. Let's move forward. Let's talk a little bit about your leadership. Let's jump into some insights here. So, what kind of strategies do you deploy to build a culture of innovation and collaboration with your teams?
If I try to think about my leadership style, I would say I'm sort of a roll up your sleeves leader. I like to be in it. For years, I told my sales VP at the time that I didn't want to rise up in management because I love being out in front of customers. So that's where I get my energy. That's where I get my joy is being in front of people. And I think, when I work with my team, it's really about how do we be better listeners and how do we do, like, I guess the word I would use almost like better discovery. How do we do that? And so, from my perspective, when we're talking to either clients or prospective clients, I try to ask them to not tell me what they want to buy or what they're looking to buy, but tell me what problem they're looking to solve. Because if somebody comes to me and says, I want to build a patient facing app for drug A, and then I want to actually send text messages, I'm like, time out. Let's, let's go back up. Maybe that's not the right solution for you. Maybe it is. Maybe you've got it all figured out, but that doesn't help me help you. So from my perspective, what I'd rather do is go back and say, tell me, what are your pain points or what problems are you trying to solve? Or, you can flip it and say, what growth opportunities do you see? Like, where do you see an opportunity? And then let's solution that together. And that's really helped us to be quite innovative because if you come to me and say, I want to build an app, maybe that's the right solution, maybe it's not. But if I understand what problem you're trying to solve, I have a really flexible platform that can do a lot of different things. So I'd rather go all the way back and tell me, what problem are you trying to solve? What pain points do you see in the patient journey? Or maybe it's in the healthcare provider journey, or maybe it's something else. And let's think about how we would solve that, how we would create a solution for you. And that's really what's allowed us to be innovative in many ways in terms of how we've developed things over the years is because the client brought us a problem and we worked together to figure out how to get to that. And the other thing is, it's really important, I think, for a client to be able to articulate what that problem is. And sometimes they can't, right? Really struggle. And so I think it's our job to kind of learn how to ask the right questions, help them to draw that out. Sometimes when they don't even know. Look, I have sometimes clients will say, well, why would we launch a product without a digital solution? And I'm like, okay, I agree with that. In this day and age, it's great to give your stakeholders, whether it's patients or providers or payers, a digital solution, but we need to know what we're solving for. And until we know that, it's really hard. And so from my perspective, it's really understanding what it is that we're solving for, helping a client figure that out, And then also kind of being able to, you asked a question earlier about how do you know you're successful? Well, we have to figure out, do we have sort of an as is? Like, what is it today? And do we have a to be? Like, where do we want to go? And sometimes that's really difficult. So we have to do the work to figure that out. And so in our business, working with, we want to have KPIs. We want to understand success metrics. I want to understand what success looks like.
Tell me a little bit about what's hard in this process. What's the difficulty in getting to that? So I know, and I'm asking that because at the crux of decision intelligence, for example, is identify a challenge or an opportunity. At the end of it, right, is what in the middle is what's the goal, and at the end is what does success actually look like? Let's measure it up. Tell me what's hard in this process.
So it's funny. There are times when we will meet with prospective customer and we'll say, "What problems are you trying to solve?" And they're like, "Oh, we don't have any." And which I love that answer. I'm like, it's always funny to me that you have no problem to solve, but there's 10 of you on the phone giving me an hour of your time for no reason, right? So then it becomes, how do you get people to either start talking or think about it, or and sometimes, maybe they're not comfortable telling you. So what do you do? So often, we'll talk about our experience. So I'll say, if we're talking to a brand manager, look, I meet with brand managers every day. So I hear from other brand managers in spaces like yours. Like, so we kind of try to, help them to understand that we do see sort of consistent challenges across the industry, or, maybe it's in specialty meds, maybe it's in rare disease, so we try to get people talking based on, we say, well, when talking to brand managers or when talking to digital health leaders, here are some of the things we quite often hear that they're struggling with. And that's usually gets people thinking and talking a little bit and feeling a little bit more comfortable. But that really can be, quite a challenge, is to get people to really think about what it is they're solving for, and, what does success look like for them?
I think it's interesting because it brings up the mindset challenge that we often have with people when you're trying to help them improve something like how you're deciding on something, right? It's very difficult because if you believe that it's already good, typically you have to correlate that to like your business growth or your revenues or your expenses, which are more than your revenues, like something like that.
I have to tell you, sometimes in the pharma space, in healthcare, revenue sometimes becomes a little bit of a dirty word. Obviously, we're all here to help patients and to have the best patient experience. But these are for profit companies as well. And so, how do we help them? I always kind of say, how do we help you make money? How do we help you spend less money? How do we help you reduce risk? And so we often put that framework together. And so it's like, we can help you make money by keeping patients on therapy and increasing the number of scripts. We can help you save money by creating operational efficiency. Digital can create a lot of operational efficiency for your business, whereas a human care team is going to be very expensive. And then obviously we can help you in an industry which is very heavily regulated like pharma. How do we help you reduce risk by creating a compliant platform for you to operate? And so we kind of use that framework very often: make money, save money, reduce risk. And that sort of is the way to get our clients started thinking about how we can build something that will help them be successful.
That's good. I'm going to ask you a question. I read the Harvard Business Review, and I was looking at some of their top 25 sort of challenges. This is called an idea in brief. This is what they say. And what I'm asking you is, how do you feel about this? Does this make sense to you? And maybe do you agree, disagree? So, virtually all organizations are plagued by addition sickness, the unnecessary rules, procedures, communications, tools, and roles that seem to grow, stifling productivity and creativity. They say the root cause is people default to asking, what can I add here? Not what can I get rid of? Organizations reward leaders for additions, implementing new technology, launching initiatives, building bigger fiefdoms, and leaders often have a limited grasp on their cone of friction, how their actions and decisions burden others. So this thing also suggests that the remedy is conduct a good riddance review to identify obstacles that can be added and removed, and deploy subtraction tools to eliminate these obstacles or make it difficult for people to erect them in the first place. So love to get your thoughts on that.
So I'm laughing to myself because as you were reading that, I wrote down on on my notebook the word friction. And
Okay.
then you said it right like 10 seconds later. So very interesting. Yeah, like we laugh sometimes. Like we'll be sitting in a meeting and we'll put up the meme that says this could have been an email. We didn't need to get all these people in a room. We're having some changes in our organization. And one of the things that we are thinking about is, what can we eliminate from a meeting perspective, from overburdening people with some of these things. But it also made me think, look, I'm a salesperson at heart. I do other things now, but at the heart of who I am is a salesperson. And I was working with one of our board members who wrote a fantastic book, and I can get you the name of it. But what he talks about is the difference between fuel and friction. We often, I'm certainly very guilty of this, is we want to add fuel to everything. So we want to more features, more benefits, right? Fuel, fuel, fuel. What we don't realize is if we're not thinking about the friction, we're bumping up against a brick wall sometimes. And so, it's our nature though to add fuel. I'll give them a better price. Give them a discount. I'll add an extra service. I'll offer them, something else. But until we figure out what the friction is and how to reduce that friction, it could be like literally bumping up against a brick wall where you're not getting through. And so when we think about it, even internally as a team or when we're trying to work with a customer and sell, is really diagnosing the friction. What stops somebody from doing something? And that was like a great like aha for me. And most recently I was working with someone on my team and he's been really trying to work with this customer for a long time. And I finally we looked at each other and we said, we got to stop adding fuel. We have to think about the friction. And when we started to really diagnose the friction, it was this customer is super busy. They're about to do a new launch. They're low on resources. It just seemed like they didn't have the time. Like, what could we do now? Like, what could we provide them that would take away some of the burden from them? How did we reduce some of the friction? And honestly, it was such an aha moment for us. And the client was even so appreciative. They're like, you get it now.
I really appreciate the friction conversation because my engineers here, they often talk about everything we lay out is fuel, right? It's all happy
Yeah.
path. We
Yeah.
always lay out the happy path. We never lay out, even when we write user stories or anything for developing new things, it's always like, oh, someone's going to click this button and it's going to be amazing. Well, what happens when they don't click that button? I mean, you could take this through any operational scenario. We never plan our operations and our processes. We often think about what's going to be great. We never think about, well, where could, if I have somebody take 10 steps, where could they fall down and not finish? So, yeah, real good. Okay, let's go to my favorite part of this, which is we're going to explore your decision making style through this little persona assessment.
Okay.
Okay. So, I'm going to ask you four questions. And for the four questions, you're not really answering them. You're only answering, identify with that anywhere between 0 and 100%. But
Okay.
you only get 100% total against all four
Oh,
questions.
okay.
So let's jump in. Let's see where you are. And then after you answer each percentage, then I will tell you what that persona is.
Okay.
Okay, so here we go. Hey, we're considering some new features for Medisafe. How do we ensure they align with patient needs and enhance their medication management experience?
Okay, so you wanna know how but I only get 100 total across
You
the
only get 100 total. How much is
hear
that?
all the questions first, or I have to answer one at a
You gotta
time?
answer one at a time.
Okay, well, I highly identify with that.
Okay.
So, I only have 100 though, so I'm gonna give that a 60.
All right, so that's 60%. That is called a feeler. Typically, feelers are a lot of gut instinct, a lot of experience and expertise gets applied in the feeler category. All right, let's keep going. So you are currently 60% feeler, you got 40% left. Reflecting on last year's patient engagement strategies, what specific trends or insights have we uncovered that could significantly influence our next initiatives?
Killing me. Wow. I guess 20%.
Oh, by the way, that's called a planner. That's the planner persona. Here's your next one. In evaluating past initiatives, what key lessons have we learned that have fundamentally changed our decision making process?
Again, that's you making it tough for me. All right, I'm gonna have to go back a little, but I'll give it 10.
Okay. All right. That's called a counter. So now you're counting it up. Here's the last one. As we formulate these new solutions for Medisafe, what specific data points are we going to rely on to validate our decisions?
I only have 10% left.
You only got 10% left.
So that's I gotta give you the 10.
Okay. Anything you want to revisit? That's called a data driver.
In essence, I consider myself a data dog. If I was looking at these and I was between feeler, planner, counter, and data, I would probably say I identify most with feeler and data, which is funny because they're sort of like at the opposite ends. I'm a big believer in gut instinct. I know that people will tell me that like the stomach is the second brain, right? That's why they call it your gut instinct because it tells you something, right? Like when your gut tells you something, you should listen to it. And I've heard some TED Talks on that being your second brain, which are super interesting. But I'm a strong believer in data as well. When I came to Medisafe, I was asking for metrics. How often do we win a deal? You know, how long is our sales cycle? Because I feel like if I can't measure it, we talked about it before, even with my customers. What is your current state and where do you want it to go? Well, if I don't know what the current state is, I can't decide where I want it to be in the future state. And so I was asking questions like at each stage of the sales cycle, how often do we close? If we get it to proposal stage, do we close 1 in 3, 1 in 5, 1 in 2? Like I need to know those numbers to be able to understand if I can move the needle. You know, every sales job I've ever taken, my boss has said to me, how do you shorten the sales cycle?
Make it shorter. That's all we.
Well, nobody knew what it was. So from my perspective, I'm a lover of data. I come from a strong data background. If you look at my career, companies I've worked for have always been strong in data. So I'm a big believer in data and what it can tell us and really understanding kind of where we are and where I think we can go. So I'm a big believer in data. But at the same time, I think what I do is more of an art than a science.
Mhm.
So my science hat wants the data, but the art side of my brain wants to be a feeler.
Well, you summed that up quite nicely. So, the idea is making balanced decisions. That's what the assessment is about, and really being able to work well with others because you want to be able to share what's important to you when you're trying to align with a team. But ultimately, you're right, right? There's art and science in decision making. So, all you've said here is that I use the data in a special Stacy way, and that's okay. And I think that especially if you listen to any of the other podcasts, what you'll hear from the super experienced leaders in their space where their domain expertise is just so deep that they're largely feelers for the same purpose. So the 1 in 4 are often the mix of the primary ways that people make decisions, especially when they've been in the space for a while. Okay, so we're going to wrap up the conversation here, but I want to ask you one final question. If you could give one piece of advice to aspiring leaders in healthcare innovation, what would it be?
I think what's worked really well for me is that I want my team to believe that I work for them. It's really, really important for me that because, you know, I'm a big believer in the 5 love languages. Everybody on my team needs something different. And so it's super important to me to understand what everyone needs and for me to be available to them in that way. I have people on my team that react differently. Some people really need sort of like quality time with you. Other people need words of encouragement. And so I think from my perspective, really getting to know the people on your team and how they work and what they need from you is super important. And it was a big lesson for me a few years ago when I actually did that with my team and kind of learned their business love languages that I had very different needs on my team. My head of marketing was all about words of encouragement. We needed that. You know, I needed to be there to like when something was really done really well to really provide those words of encouragement. I had other people on my team who like their love language was gifts. They needed rewards. So when they did something great, they needed, you know, the Amazon gift card or, you know, something like that. Where for other people that meant nothing. They really needed that quality time. They needed me to spend that hour, 2 hours a week with them, like going through their workload. And so that was a really big eye opener for me that And guess what? All of their languages were different than mine. And so I think, a lot of times we do what we think, what we need might be what other people need, but really figuring out how people work, what makes them tick, what gives them energy is super important to be a successful leader.
Thank you so much for that. That was super insightful. I agree. I think it's really important to get to know and understand the folks who are on your team. Stacey, it has been a pleasure having you on the show. Your expertise is powerful, and we thank you for spending the time with us. Can you share with our listeners where they can learn more about you and Medisafe?
Sure. So, absolutely, you can go to medisafe.com, or I encourage everyone to go to the App Store or Google Play and download Medisafe. It's a fantastic tool. And you can also find me on LinkedIn at Stacey Meltzer Wasserman.
Fantastic. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. Remember, the best decisions come from great conversations. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe, rate it, share it with your network. Let's keep the conversation going on social media using Dynamic Decisions Podcast. And until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and keep leading with purpose.